To me, I see IFS as more than a therapy. I see a really beautiful way to understand the human mind. So, the way I see the mind is that we all have a core self that just is. It's innately whole, innately healed, and it's free from agenda. It engages in the world with no agenda beyond simply being with what's there, with curiosity and compassion. So, we have this self. But within our psyche, we also have subpersonalities or parts that possess their own particular qualities and characteristics that allow us to interact with the world around us. Maybe there's a part of our personality that's particularly fun-loving and playful. Maybe there's another part that possesses a sense of drive and assertiveness. Maybe there's a part that's more of a nurturer. And all of these parts make up this inner system within us that create the personality of Ella or the personality of Adriana. And it can be strange to think of ourselves as having multiple parts within us in this way. But a really basic example I often use to help just tune into how natural this language of parts can actually be is to just think about if you have a big work deadline or assignment due, but you've also been invited to a really fun party with your closest friends. You might notice multiple parts come up. One that wants to blow off the assignment and go have fun, or one that wants to be responsible and say no to the party to get the job done. Those are really basic examples of multiple parts that exist within our mind, right? And in that moment, there's a bit of a conflict going on between them. But if you've got that connection to your core self I mentioned, it can help allow both parts to be heard and validated and made space for, and then maybe a decision can be made without it creating too much tension or denying either one of these parts in your system. And then where IFS therapy comes in is, something really important we see as therapists is that while, yes, we do have this core self of us, when we're younger, our brain isn't fully developed yet. And this can impact our experience of self or cause us to actually forget that we even have this core self for a number of reasons. So, an explanation I like to use for this is kind of unrelated to IFS, but I like to use Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. And listeners can look this up, but it's just where you turn your hand into a fist, and that represents the different layers of the brain. In a fully functioning, optimal adult brain, we have our emotional survival brain kind of sitting in the inner layers of our brain, where the palm and the thumb is. And on the top where our fingers curl over, we have what's called our cortex, right? That thinking brain that helps give us a sense of time, context, reasoning, logic, and meaning making. And so what happens is something can happen around us in our life, and our survival brain will use emotions to tell us whether it's safe or dangerous. And that's a really important thing for our brains to do. If there's a grizzly bear charging towards us, we want the brain to become flooded with fear and tell us to run or fight or play dead. But it's also important to have access to that thinking brain, right? To maybe bring in context and tell us, hey, actually, that's not a grizzly bear. We're in the middle of a shopping mall in Sydney where there are no bears. So I'm actually safe and fine, so I don't need that fear response. And that's a really silly example, but you can see how that cortex helps us to regulate our emotions and gives us space to be connected to that core self energy I was talking about before. But that cortex, that thinking brain, we don't have full access to that as children. It's not actually fully developed until our early 20s, really. And so, what can happen is that if there's some traumatic event, or maybe multiple events, especially in our early life, that maybe feel painful, scary, confusing, or too overwhelming for that emotional brain to handle, but we don't yet have access to a thinking brain to help us make sense of it or regulate it. Whether that's because we don't have access to our own cortex or the presence of an attuned adult who can lend us their cortex. If that's not there in those moments, it almost kind of cuts us off from that sense of self energy that can provide us with the compassion or the clarity that we need to make that pain okay or bearable. And these things that are experienced as traumatic don't have to be something like a grizzly bear coming towards us. Humans are social beings, we're a social species, and so often what causes trauma, what causes the most pain, fear, confusion, overwhelm for us in our system is often some sort of social threat, whether that's rejection, whether that's us finding out that a part of us isn't acceptable to someone. That feels like a threat to our survival. And so suddenly, this part that's just innate to us maybe gets the message that it's not acceptable to our family, to our community, to our loved one. And we don't have the cortex there, that thinking brain, to help us make sense of why. And so then what happens is, it's like it's up to those subparts in the psyche to deal with this painful experience alone. And the first point of order will often be to try to kind of encapsulate the painful experience that feels too much for the brain to cope with, almost like putting it into this bubble and out of reach from the rest of the psyche as a way to say, okay, the brain can't deal with this right now. Let's put it over here, out of sight and out of reach, so that the rest of Adriana can keep functioning. And these are called the exiles in IFS, parts that have been exiled because of the pain or burdens that they're carrying. And so then, after that part has been exiled, these other parts that maybe originally were aspects of the personality that were playful or assertive or nurturing or whatever, then have to take on new roles in the system to try and keep this exile at bay. They often fear that if the exile gets poked at or unleashed, the pain will just overwhelm us all over again. So they have to adopt strategies to try and manage the system or protect that from happening. These are called protector parts in IFS, and they can take on all sorts of jobs to make that happen. There are manager parts that might be critics, perfectionists, caretakers, people pleasers, etc. And they're working proactively to prevent anything from happening again that could make that exiled pain come up. And then there are also firefighters that work reactively to put that exiled pain back into its bubble if it ever does get triggered and come up again. So those can often be parts that react through numbing behaviors, addictions, or maybe by lashing out. But with this understanding of the mind through IFS, we can see that all these parts of us, no matter how negative or extreme their behavior might be, are just working really hard to try to protect us from pain that they think will overwhelm us. And I think what's really important to note here, and why I like to bring in this explanation about the brain, is that even though as we get older, our brain does eventually become equipped with a fully functioning cortex, those painful parts of us that have been encapsulated and exiled, and those ones that have taken on roles trying to protect us from that exiled pain, haven't been privy to that experience of brain development. They often just keep operating as though they're the age they first got frozen in. And so continuing to do what they do often feels like a matter of life or death for them, because they see themselves as alone in the system, like it's up to them to protect us from this threat of pain. They don't know there's a self there that could help, let alone how to access it. So understanding all this can start to bring us so much more compassion to whatever issues we're facing in ourselves or our lives, right? It starts to explain why we get stuck in some of the patterns of behaviors that we do, or find ourselves stuck in cycles within our relationships, even when we maybe have other logical or adult parts of us that don't want us to react or feel the way that we do. And the beautiful and most important gift that IFS therapy brings is one of healing, where we can learn to remember that core self of us that we all have. And then we can learn to welcome all these parts that exist within us from that place of self that's just inherently compassionate and kind and curious. And in the process of doing this, those parts that we maybe have struggled with or seen as problematic in us can start to soften and feel held and heal. And maybe even learn that the painful thing they're protecting us from isn't so big or scary after all, that it itself is one of those intrinsic, beautiful parts of our personality that just took on this burden of pain. to me, and what I think has made me just the biggest IFS nerd to the point where I'm now doing a podcast on it, is that IFS is the ultimate model of self compassion. It teaches us to be with all of our parts with kindness, and that's where all healing stems from, in my opinion.